Okay, sorry about that. So I just had to make sure that this was going to record and that the volume was okay with the music in the background. I hope everybody is cool with that. It's always nice to have a little music going, or else PowerPoint presentations can kind of get a little dry, if you know what I mean. So we'll take it from this slide right here with early man, and in part one I just kind of hashed out the introduction to the course, the astronomy course, what astronomy is seeking to answer and discover. So you should have a pretty good idea of that after, especially reading after that description that I wrote. So anyway, beginning with early man and astronomy, we said before that astronomy is the oldest of the natural sciences. It began with very simple observations that probably the earliest humans made. If you think about cavemen or very early Neolithic primitive humans, at some point humans had to start thinking and making observations and maybe even wondering what the heck they were seeing. Could even be before words were invented. Those simple observations really began the essence of astronomy. It was noticing that maybe for a certain period of time, even though probably the concept of time wasn't invented or thought of, but for some period of time it was light out, and for some period of time it was dark out, and maybe we associated hunting and gathering and activity with the lit portion of that time period because it was easier to move around and whatever, and we associated with sleeping and staying away from hungry predators, guarding with the nighttime. So from early on, man started making observations and connections with his environment, and a lot of those first observations were probably the very obvious observations that we have what we call diurnal motion and diurnal cycles. That would be the daily rising and setting of things in the sky. So that's really when we would say astronomy began, although we don't really have recorded observations or recorded evidence from those very early days. But we do have some markings on bones and seashells and cave walls of obvious things in the sky, like the phases of the moon. And those are cavemen taking blood or dirt or some kind of other clay staining materials and drawing these symbols on cave walls and on bone carvings and things. So they made those observations, which is pretty cool to realize. So a lot of the ancestors, when they looked up and made those observations early on, were figuring out that they could use them to orient themselves, to navigate. Later on in history, well after that early Neolithic period, kind of the transition between nomadic lifestyles and settlements would be the advent of time, calendric systems and calendars. And then kind of from that we figured out when we could plant and harvest. And when we learned to do agriculture, everything changed. We were no longer nomadic peoples. We started making settlements. And also people were looking at those things in the sky and very quickly attributing them to their movement, because they'd see things moving around. They would start to say those must be gods and goddesses, and we should worship them and we should keep track of them. And they became, anything in the sky that moved regularly became very important, like the sun, moon, the planets. Even though they didn't know they were planets, they were just points of light to them, but everything was very important in the sky. So they thought that these things that were moving up there must be either the gods and goddesses themselves or things representing their gods and goddesses that were being, persuaded to move around the sky. Okay, and they tried to get to know those movements in a lot of cultures, because the thought of knowing how the things in the sky were moving would bring you closer to an understanding of that god or goddess that you worshipped. It would bring you closer into a relationship with that deity. So, very important stuff there for early man. Believe they were among the stars and planets. I think I covered that. So astronomy early on for early people, Stone Age people, Neolithic, and then the early settlements, really tied to agriculture, religion. Divination is tied, the divining of different things, gods and goddesses, and connections on what happens to Earth is connected to what happens in the sky. Prophecy, belief systems. People would sometimes look at anything in the sky and they would really think that it had a connection to what happens on Earth. Now, in some cases, that's true scientifically, but this was more akin to astrology way back in the day. So astrology and astronomy share very common roots before they actually split and went separate ways. One as a pseudoscience religion, the other as a pure science. In a lot of cultures, astronomers who were kind of like the priests who did all the predicting and who really knew their sky, trying to predict eclipses and things. If they got that wrong, they were often beheaded or killed. That was often the case in the ancient Chinese culture, because the emperor would gain power by being able to tell the people when the sun was going to go dark or when the moon was going to turn red. That if you could do that, the average populace would look at you and say, wow, that guy or that person is powerful, we shouldn't cross them, they should be our ruler. And so if you didn't get your prediction wrong and you were in front of your whole civilization, you looked like a fool. And then you turn to your astronomy court, your priests who did the astronomy and astrology, and be like, what the heck, I thought you told us that this was going to be what's happening. I looked like an idiot out there, so now I'm going to kill you. And that's how it went. So pretty harsh life back then for some priest astronomers. We have the bone records and cave walls and seashells. Here's some pictures of what I'm talking about. We think this is an elephant bone found in Africa on the eastern side, maybe Kenya. Very early, hundreds of thousands of years old. Not hundreds of thousands, but many thousands of years old. Tens of thousands for sure. And we think that these carvings are tied to the lunar cycles and possibly even to a woman's menstrual cycles, if you can believe it or not. So somebody was trying to keep track of something on this very, very old bone. Okay, and so that's evidence of some kind of a cyclical motion or observation that they were making. As nomadic people traveled around the world, they started settling as they got agriculture going, and then they would even start to build structures to keep track of what was going on in the sky and to worship those gods and goddesses that they kind of created. First calendars were born from that. A lot of the early structures were just simple markers, stone, wood, lines in the earth. We'll see some examples of that in a second. Then they moved on to more complicated temples and tombs. Stonehenge, Newgrange, these are all very early Stone Age structures. Bighorn Medicine Wheel in the United States. Nabta, the southern Egypt, just kind of a stone circle. The Nazca lines. So this is a diagram of Stonehenge. We can see that the center part, and then we have this outer smaller ring of circles. We have a lot of alignments. So if you stand in the center and you see the sun, coming up over this heel stone, then that indicates the summer solstice, and that's a good time to do, planting or harvesting. Looking this way, an alignment here indicates winter solstice, most southerly moonrise. So Stonehenge can indicate a whole lot of different celestial happenings with the sun, moon, and other things. This is Newgrange, the tomb in Ireland, very, very old, predates even Stonehenge. And at a certain day in the year, if you look down this tomb, it's a shaft that runs all the way to the center of this giant mound. Now this is a huge, huge structure. I mean, here's a typical house. That's a doorway right there, so you can see a person would be smaller than that. So it's a big, big structure. At one day in the year, at one of the solstices, the sun shines all the way down this shaft and lights up some carvings on the back wall in the center of this thing, which is really neat to see. A lot of people come and they flock to this area when that's happening. Still today, to see it, this whole area fills up with people, and it's a big event. That's in Ireland. This is the Bighorn Medicine Wheel, black and white picture. You can see some of the alignments happening there. If you want to take a look more at these pictures, you can just pause this video. I'm going to keep going here just for the sake of time. A lot like Stonehenge, the Bighorn Medicine Wheel is. Here is the Nabta stone circle in Egypt, and you're thinking to yourself, well, that's stupid, I could make something like that. Yeah, but this is one thing we found way out in the middle of the desert that's been preserved. Appears not to have been touched, which is really cool, because typically something like this, you'd think somebody would come around and kick these over and mess with them, but it's been preserved. Everybody, you look at this and you're like, okay, I don't care. But we found that it's very old, and people use this as kind of a calendar. Here are the Nazca lines down in Chile, which is really, really cool. So, I'm sorry, not in Chile. They are in Peru, if I'm getting my countries right. And I actually got to see these I was on a cycling trip in South America for about a year, and we rode through Peru. And one of the guys on the trip actually took an airplane up and paid some money and got to see the lines. This is from an aerial view. When you're way down on the ground, you obviously can't see this big structure. And what do you think this looks like? And if you said seahorse, you're wrong. It's a monkey. Yay, monkey. All right, and we think that these were prayer lines and also associated with a lot of things in the sky. So the ancient Nazca people would walk these lines. It would take hours and hours to walk all these lines. It's only about 2 feet wide, this line. And what it is underneath this oxidized layer of soil, this kind of brown layer of soil, there's this white, salty soil. And if you could just kick away some of the soil with the top layer with your hand, you would find this gleaming white layer underneath. And these lines are preserved by a local community, I think it's a museum that goes out and preserves them. And you're not really supposed to go out and walk on them, but yeah, and when people aren't looking, you can go out there. Pretty neat and pretty old. And some more examples here of those Nazca lines. What do you think that is? No, it's not a porcupine. Good guess. It is a hummingbird. For those of you who got that, very good. Let's see. Okay, moving on to ancient China. Oldest culture with recorded astronomical observations. First people to record solar eclipses, supernova, stellar positions in a catalog. Astronomy is really tied to politics. These were the people, the emperors didn't want to be wrong when they did their predictions of things, so gave power to the emperors. Ability to predict eclipses and comets with astonishing accuracy. Yeah, they did have that. They knew how to make their predictions very accurately. Their priests were pretty good. Here's an example of a constellation map from ancient China, and you can maybe, if you look carefully, recognize some constellations that we kind of still have today. So if you kind of look around here, maybe you can see something like right here. We have a constellation that looks a lot like this cross type figure. We call it Cygnus. Maybe if you look closely enough, you'll even find the Big Dipper out there, Cygnus kind of over here. So if you know your constellations, but many cultures had different constellations. A constellation is a group of stars. You connect it with certain lines to make a pattern. And you can make whatever type of pattern you want. You could make your constellations however you want right now. However, there are 88 officially recognized constellations. Here's a map of comets. A lot of the ancient Chinese would document the types of comets and the tails that they saw. Okay, and this is an example of a very old document that describes the different types of comet tails that observers would see. In ancient Egypt, we think the pyramids were aligned with certain stars to help the pharaohs get to the afterlife. They didn't consider Orion to be Orion. They called it Osiris, which is the god of the afterlife, Osiris. And so they aligned the pyramids with those 3 belt stars to help the pharaohs get to the afterlife. They used the star of Isis, which we call today Sirius, to predict the flooding of the Nile and do agriculture. So it's really linked to religious stuff and agriculture. A lot of temples built to honor different gods, keep track of movements. Here's a great picture of the Great Pyramids of Giza, as they are looking today, very deteriorated but still very massive structures. And some 3 smaller periods in the foreground there. This is the apparent alignment between the 3 belt stars in Orion and the pyramids on the ground. You can see here are the stars as we see them in the sky, like this, and there's this kind of shape. It seems to be a really nice alignment between these 3 stars here in the pyramids. The Mayans, a very mysterious culture, disappeared, just kind of vanished out of thin air. We think they were probably wiped out by disease from the conquering Spanish conquistadors in the early centuries AD. So they were around the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico. They built a lot of structures, obviously